Joanna Macy, the great environmental activist and systems ecologist, said that when faced with planetary crisis, there are three stories we can tell ourselves. Business as usual, in which we tell ourselves that some degree of damage is necessary for human progress. The great unraveling, in which we tell ourselves that mass ecosystem destruction is inevitable. And the great turning, in which we tell ourselves that evolving the way we live is the only way forward, and that we're at the beginning of one of the great projects in human history. On this podcast, we talk to people who are writing that third story, with their own work and their own lives. Mission-driven leaders who are dedicated to social and environmental impact at this critical moment for our species. Welcome to The Turning Point. So Ian, we have had a lot of guests on this show now over the last 6-7 months. And there's been a lot of overlap between clients that we work with and the guests we've had on this show. And not surprising for us, but we have found that mission-driven founders, mission-driven business owners are a little bit different than the average business owner. They're more driven by the impact that they're having in the world. They're more focused on what that mission means to them and means to everyone in the organization, but they still have a lot of the same problems that other business owners have. And so they find themselves in a unique space in terms of what they need for support, what they need to work on and develop from a skill set standpoint, the challenges that they're working with. It's more complex than the average business owner. And we found that we understand them, they understand us, and we see the sort of common archetype developing. And we've realized that the needs they have are a little different. And so our idea here is we're going to start this sort of sub-version of our podcast where we're speaking specifically to those people and trying to offer them perspective from all of our experience and all of the other mission-driven leaders that we work with and interview, and sort of provide a consolidated space for all of that insight.
Yeah, I'm excited for it. I think it's inaccurate to explain them as like juxtaposing needs, right? But one need being how do I run a successful business, and then the other need being how do I stay true to a moral compass. And I'm also not suggesting that all entrepreneurs who are just looking to make money don't have a moral compass, but it makes the meal planning and the prep, a little bit more challenging when it comes to business development. So I'm happy to do it. Let's dive in.
Yeah. And just because if you're out there trying to make a buck, we're not calling you an amoral loser. We're just saying, maybe you're not for this podcast. So the idea to start with is we're going to pick kind of major topics that we find emerging across our client base and our podcast interview base. And the thing we're going to go with today is one of your babies, one of your favorite topics, prioritization. So that word can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So can you just start us off and talk about what this word means to you and why you think it's so important?
If you ask me what are the top 3 most important words in, running a successful business or, being a successful consultant or whatever, this would be one of the top 3. It might be the top word. To me, I think in order to define prioritization, we have to take a step back and we have to understand or be on the same page about what is strategy. And I think my favorite definition of strategy, which I've found or heard, is it's simply the allocation of limited resources to unlimited options. Right? When you're in a business, you have an infinite number of decisions to make, an infinite number of directions to go, but you have a finite amount of resources to devote to those decisions, those endeavors. And so strategy is just allocating those limited resources to unlimited options. Okay, so we've got that mental frame. From there, once we decide the path forward, once we determine the strategy, then we're searching for leverage. Okay, so this is the direction we want to go. What are the fewest number of critical decisions we could make that would have the biggest impact, right? How do we allocate those resources? And then from leverage, once we identify kind of these subtasks, then we can start to talk about focus, right? How are the resources within the business, being time, energy, money, emotions, etc., being allocated to these high leverage actions? I think these 3 things, right? Strategy, leverage, and focus, they all kind of create prioritization, right? It's not like a a monolith. Prioritization is not a monolith, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome framework to start with. And if I could reframe that in like the simplest language possible, what I'm hearing, and I love when you give this framework to our clients, it's where are you going? How are you going to get there? And what is it going to take to do the things that are going to get you there? Is that a good summary?
Yeah.
Okay. So those things I think are that framework, right? Those three levels of prioritization, if you will. I think they could apply to any business. So how have you noticed it's a little bit different for the kind of people we work with, the mission-driven leaders?
Mm-hmm. You know, going back to the intro, it's kind of this, it's at least a 2-layered cake, right? And one layer, which is probably the foundation, are just the business essentials. How do we run a successful business? How do we keep the doors open? How do we keep the lights on? And then the layer on top of that is, and how do we do it in a way that is aligned with our mission? Now, I think the unique advantage that a mission-driven founder or business has is that usually they come into existence with the mission first. And so, therefore, the North Star is kind of there from the beginning. But then, of course, such as in life, we have to make negotiations along the way, right? Okay, this is the North Star we're pursuing, but in order to keep the lights on, we need to do X. And those things might not be perfectly aligned with one another. And so the way that I like to think about this is through the concept of counterbalance. You know, it's often like this term or this phrase of balance is often thrown out there, right? Work-life balance or whatever. And in reality, what it conjures up in my mind is this straight line. It's a linear path from A to B or Z. And that's not how it works, right? It's this counterbalance approach. It's like this zigzagged path where we're trying to approximate the direction that we're trying to go in the most efficient manner possible. And so, you know, a solely profit-motivated company can have a really long arc in the sense of we're just going to double down on this strategy or this approach, and it's kind of like a growth at all costs mentality, and they can just ride that wave for as long as it works. Whereas a mission-driven business or founder has that little birdie on their shoulder all the time saying, is this taking you closer to your mission? And so it's this kind of waffling back and forth, this counterbalance, this zigzag back and forth to try and course correct to make sure that they can run a successful business and continue to pursue the North Star.
Yeah, so that takes a lot of sophisticated awareness to be constantly monitoring the impact of what you're doing and also monitoring the viability of the business itself.
Yeah, I mean, there's a restaurant in the basement of the building that I'm in right now, and they have not been open for the last week, and we're not exactly sure why. But at the time that we're recording this, you know, there are protests happening in the Twin Cities. It's January 16th of 2026. Perhaps that business has chosen to close for the time being, and it's a value-based decision. It's clearly not the right one for their bottom line, right? They're not making money. They are still paying rent. But if they have chosen to close for a value-based decision, then they're following their North Star in that sense, right? It's a values thing.
Right. And at the same time, right, they're probably monitoring the sentiment of their employees, the sentiment of the people in the community and in the neighborhood, and also looking at their balance sheet and saying, how long can we afford to make this value-based decision, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. And right. And to your point, there's no perfectly right answer. And I think this is, to me, one of the things that distinguishes being a mission-driven leader from, like you said, just a bottom-line focused business leader. When your only focus is the bottom line, like you said, it can be pretty linear. It can be pretty clear what the right decision is. But when you're balancing bottom line with values, now there's no perfect answer. And there's a murky world that you have to navigate. And I think a lot of the leaders that we work with feel really seen when we understand that's the world they're operating in and that we have experience guiding them through that process.
Yeah, I mean, I think a perfect example of this, or a recent one that comes to mind, is Sarah Brown from Gatherwell, right? I mean, her podcast, she was very clear with how she feels about the Western, I shouldn't say Western medicine, but, you know, specifically Western healthcare system. Having come from that system, she feels like, okay, it's totally broken. It's a complete train wreck. She's still working within the healthcare system. She's just trying to do it differently. And so that naturally arises and surfaces all sorts of negotiations that she has to make on a daily basis, to run a successful business, but provide healthcare in a way that feels aligned with the way that she feels it should be done best.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great example. And Sarah, I think, embodies that very well. She understands that balance, just is always looking for support. Like, how do I make this work? She doesn't necessarily know like where that path is taking her. And so her decision-making process feels like 6 months at a time. Mm-hmm. Taking this just a little further, in all of your work in this world, like to talk about the connection between inner transformation and external impact. So how does this relate to the conversation we're having about how that helps mission-driven leaders make those prioritizations within their work and their organizations?
This is probably an uncommon association, but one word that I associate with entrepreneurship is vulnerability. By definition, being an entrepreneur and running and building a business means operating in the unknown. And so, maybe vulnerability isn't the perfect word for it, but there's a certain amount of like resolve that one has to have in order to continue down this path. And that's not just a professionally oriented trait, right? That's a personally oriented trait. Okay, I don't know if this is going to work, but it means enough to me to keep banging my head against this wall to try and figure it out. That fire comes from somewhere internally, And for those of us that have chosen to, really turn this into our life's work, whether it's a lifestyle business or whether it's a startup or whether it's a bona fide, mid-size or multinational corporation, generally the seed is started from something within, right? And there's a intrinsic motivating factor that helps light the fire. But of course, lighting the fire is just the first step, right? Then we have to understand and build the skill set of like tending to the fire. Again, understanding what it means. What are the skill sets to run a successful business? And what are the skill sets to do so in a way that doesn't compromise the core values of the mission, right? Or myself as the founder, or whatever you want to insert there. And so there's this relationship that exists in tension, right? And it's not just in business. It's not just in mission-driven businesses. We see this everywhere. It's like the way of evolution itself, the yin and the yang. You can see this duality everywhere. But the biggest rewards are often connected to the biggest risks, right? We're going to bet a sizable amount of the resources in this organization on this strategy because we think it's got a lot of leverage. We think it has a big payout at the end, or a potential big payout at the end. That's a risk. It's an unknown. You're forming a hypothesis. So the reason that I can't help but tie in this inner transformation work along the way is because I think in order to be a successful entrepreneur, you have to have probably an overdeveloped sense of self-awareness. You have to be a little bit more attuned to yourself than the average bear, because you're going to use that skill set in your day-to-day business operations invariably. You can't separate the two.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to put it. I think one thing that comes to mind is how many of the people that we work with and interview have gone through a career shift of some sort based on exactly the thing you're talking about. That inner spark happens. I think about our friend Nick Rinke, who, former CEO of Habitaire, talking about having like a totally successful career in crop insurance, and then finding that conventional success meant very little to him, and then having to redesign his whole career to find something impactful. And so when you're making choices that are not purely in your financial self-interest, now you have a whole different world to navigate, right? It just like we were saying before, the simple business decision, the simple bottom line based decision is often quite simple. The decision to pursue meaningful impact in the world and also still have practical concerns, that demands a lot more self-awareness of like, where is my risk tolerance, right? Where am I comfortable? And then extending that risk to my team and people who depend on me to make a living, right? Sarah Brown, again, from Gatherwell, talking about that. she is purposely choosing a career which is more risky, and she's inviting other people into that risk with her. So how does she navigate that? What is the emotional intelligence required of a leader like her to bring people into that venture with her?
Yeah. And, back to that notion of like counterbalancing. As the business develops and grows, we have to use its mission and the core values as a litmus test for decision making. Mike from Q Rounds, he has this amazingly elegant solution to bring together the care team in an acute care setting through a simple app, right, that organizes literally a doctor's rounds. As I think about that interview and that conversation, he's already a pediatric doctor. His origin story is sitting in a Fantastic Sam's and he's got his app open, there's a wait list. And then he's like, oh, why don't we just like grow this new limb on the tree? It's already pretty aligned. Whereas Dory is developing an entirely new technology for healthcare, from Acumen Medical. And hers was born from, I think she said in the conversation that she was kind of like a founder by accident. But that company was in some ways born out of her own personal story and personal experience, right, with her child. And so, again, there's like this North Star, this mission in the business. And that's great because it gives us a litmus test, again, to make decisions along the way. But as you pointed out early on, it adds an additional layer of complexity.
Absolutely. So let's get a little more practical about how this philosophy gets applied, right? I think a lot of people at least recognize what we're talking about. Can you start by giving us maybe 3 or 4 of the essential frameworks that get you started when thinking about how to prioritize work?
Yeah, I mean, there's a grab bag here that we could choose from, and so maybe you can help me identify which tools or guide this conversation in the direction that you're hoping to go. But at the foundation, we have to understand the essentials. Like, what are the rules that we're playing by, right? And in business in general, supply and demand is an important one. And it's not just supply and demand from a marketplace perspective. It's also supply and demand in terms of the allocation of resources within your organization. And so I think that is a really important conversation that, we end up having it on a daily basis with our clients, because the natural orientation of an entrepreneur is, well, I'll just do that too, right? I'll just pile that on the to-do list. I'll just get it done. And then sometimes it gets done and sometimes it doesn't. Now, of course, if you're running a business, there is work that just has to get done. Stuff you didn't plan on, and then boom, all of a sudden it's on your plate now and you have to deal with it. But there's a very fine line between that and then like unconsciously just saying yes to everything because we haven't developed the skill set to prioritize. Right? So that's where I would say first. And then it's amazing to me how many people can operate within an organization without specific goals in mind. You've heard me talk about this analogy before of like, if you're in a pirate ship out at sea and you're searching for buried treasure and you have a map, but there's no X on the map in terms of where the buried treasure is, how are you going to get there? If you don't set clear goals, what is your barometer for success? How do you measure success? And so without those clear goals, without that clear direction, it makes it almost inevitable that we end up chasing our tails more than is necessary. So I think those are just table stakes, right? And then in terms of like how to do the work, what are some practical frameworks? We talk about a lot of the same stuff in the beginning of our work with clients often. One of those things is, what we have lovingly termed the BOP-IT process. It's just a very simple and systematic way of thinking through creative problem solving or complex problem solving. BOP-IT is an acronym that just stands for brainstorm, organize, prioritize, right? So it works for anything. Just sit down and come up with all the ideas, organize your thoughts, and then prioritize them, right? It's based on like how our brains actually think and how we navigate different spaces in our brain. Pareto's law, which I'm sure most people are familiar with or at least have heard of, the 80-20 principle. Again, what are the highest leverage actions to take? Parkinson's law, we talk about a lot, which starts to bleed into time management. But another way to think about this is the amount of time you give yourself to complete something is the amount of time it's going to take to do it. And so again, if you don't have a specific goal with a specific end date, then things just kind of loom, and that's not always helpful. And then I think the last thing that I'll mention here is the maker versus manager schedule. Invariably, change management in an organization is ultimately behavior modification in individuals. And in order to get an entire team rowing in the same direction, they all have to understand where they're going and what rules they're playing by, and what it means to be a good team member. And one thing that means is, like, for the people that are on the front lines in the organization, give them time to do their job. We don't need to be in meetings all day. Meetings are often a sore excuse for poor planning and poor decision-making processes and poorly documented work processes.
Yeah, and you're right. When you explain it like that, and I mean, I've witnessed you explaining this to our clients dozens of times at this point, but it is amazing how so many successful organizations do not apply what seem like simple architecture to manage their time and manage their efforts. And simple processes like this have been so powerful for our clients. And I'm speaking from experience. I mean, you and I even end up having to reapply this stuff to our own work lives all the time. And we teach this stuff. And it's just, to me, that's just a credit to how difficult it is to be continually prioritizing your time and making sure you're spending it in the most effective ways possible.
Exactly.
So,
I mean,
so there's,
yeah.
So I'm just saying there's no shade whatsoever to anyone who's listening to this and saying, oh man, I'm in too many meetings, I suck. Not the case.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we should probably do a better job articulating that, like, in terms of the no shade. Running a business is damn difficult, and it's extremely complex, and there's a million decisions to make every single day. And so it's so easy to get sidetracked because there are always more things vying for our attention than there are things we can give our attention to. And this is where Pareto's law is so applicable, this 80-20 principle. Generally speaking, the 20% of your efforts that give you 80% of your results are the basics. And if you're not doing the basics, if you don't understand what the basics are, and if you haven't maximized the amount of basics you're doing that really drive the needle in the business, the rest is probably just fluff. It makes you feel productive, but in reality, you're just staying busy. But again, one of the complexities here is that at each stage of business development, the basics change. And so, it's kind of like this notion of, as soon as you start to feel comfortable and then you hit your next stage of business development, you have to kind of like relearn the whole skill set. But eventually it just becomes a game of pattern recognition. And it can be really hard to do that when you're just in the weeds every day. And so I think that's one thing that I hope that's one thing that, in terms of value that we offer our clients, is just helping them kind of just get their head above water and take time to stop and ask the critical questions, do the critical thinking, and then fly at that 10,000 foot view where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, now that I see the landscape in this way from this perspective, it makes it easier to get back down on the ground and carve the path through the weeds.
And, my favorite part of that process is as our clients get comfortable with these skill sets of doing the 80-20, of creating maker and manager schedules, and they see the impact of it. And then we anchor back up to that tension between the impact values and the day-to-day success of the business. And they start to see how that toggling that you talk about between those two applies to that very grounded prioritization. That's when you can see they're like the lights come on and they're like, oh, this is how I'm going to be doing this for the next 10 years. Mm-hmm. And that's a really cool moment when it all starts to click like that.
Right. It's like when you understand the fundamentals of reading well enough to go it alone, you're like, cool, I don't know how to say this word, but I can sound it out, And I think that's just like, it's probably an oversimplification, but I agree with you. Like when we see those lights come on, because we're in the weeds with them every day, right? I mean, like that's what we do, is we're often in there with our machetes as well. But to create a clearing that's wide enough to like be able to breathe, have space, and then to understand or to kind of reach that level of mastery with a certain skill set where now you can see like, oh, I could apply it over here in this way, and I could adapt it in this way over there. That's really when it starts to pick up steam.
Yeah. And just to say it again, we have a way of making it sound really simple when you and I talk. But like you said, we're in the weeds with our clients every day, and we're struggling with it just as much as they are. Like, how are we going to get to that spot where vision is clear and there's space to breathe and we can start really putting one foot in front of the other and making this organization go?
Yeah, I mean, the fundamentals, like back to the pattern recognition thing, we hear our clients say a lot. One of the advantages is that you didn't know our industry because you're not kind of indoctrinated in the way that this industry thinks about X, Y, or Z. But for us, it's just a game of pattern recognition as well, like at a high level, you know. And so once we can kind of orient on that treasure map, then we can drop down a layer. We can chunk down and say, oh, okay, we can see this as being the most efficient path to where we're trying to go.
Yeah. So let's drill down a little bit further. Obviously, every business, every sector is unique. But speaking of pattern recognition, we've recognized some patterns too about what mission-driven leaders often do need to start prioritizing. So let's talk about some of the common misperceptions or challenges to properly prioritizing for mission-driven leaders.
So back to prioritization. I think the number one thing that any company could do is prioritize deep work. Or another way of saying that is just like uninterrupted focus time. You know, and this is where the maker versus manager schedule is so important. Makers need time to make, managers need time to manage. Managing typically requires meetings. Making requires focus, right? So ensuring that there is a time for makers in your company to do deep focused work. But that, of course, is predicated upon where people are putting their attention, right? Where are they applying their resources? How are they approaching their work? How does the work get done, not only as individuals, but across teams? And then what the work is, right? So from simple things like how to run a meeting and how to run it efficiently and how to get the things out of the meeting that you want, because again, they can often just be a poor excuse for like unclear decision-making processes or undocumented work processes, all the way to, okay, this is a deep work thing, this really moves the lever in our business, and we need to just build it. And that's the sprint for the next, 90 days. But regardless, a company needs time to do deep work. Everybody in the company. Even managers should be taking that time to do deep work to really thinking about how can they move the metrics that are critical. And then you asked about common misperceptions as well. You know, this is probably going to echo what I said earlier about being amazed at how often there aren't clear goals in any one company, you know, or in a team. I think this is probably more common in the small business space, but regardless, that also translates to team members understanding what they're supposed to be doing and why they're doing it. Too many orgs just have too much of the silo effect. And so team members in one department don't necessarily understand how their role rolls up into the larger strategy in the business, nor do they have an understanding about how their work impacts the department next to them. And so when team members are operating in this void of information, that lack of understanding creates chaos. And it's not necessarily intentional. It's just because everyone's operating from a different script. And so until we get everybody on the same page, those multiple scripts are going to be competing with each other. You know, one of my favorite business quotes is from Gary Keller. And it's something to the effect of, if you want everybody in the company on the same page, there can only be one page. You know, so helping people just understand, like, what are they doing and why are they doing it? And how is it impacting the larger mission or vision of the company? I think these things are often assumed, especially by someone like a mission-driven founder. It's so clear to them why people are doing the work they're doing, but they have the whole script in their head and they've been there since day one. The new hire who's coming in to fill a particular role doesn't have that backstory. So how do we get them up to speed so that they understand where their puzzle piece fits in the larger picture?
Yeah, and to pull out something that you already said, but I just want to pull it out and highlight it. Managers and founder level leaders, so important for them to have time for deep work so they can do that strategic visioning and find really concrete ways to communicate that out to their team. In a lot of ways, as the company grows and you have productive, successful teams working under you, that's your job, to create that single page and make sure that everybody is working from it. And, you know, we see leaders so often as the company grows, they're forced to transition into a different role. They were the one on the ground doing the work every day, and now they're managing the growth of the business itself. And the thing, like you said, that was just in their head, like, this is where we're going. I know where we're going every day. They didn't have to think about that. But now they have to create that one page that everybody is working off of, because the new people coming in aren't inside of your head.
Exactly.
They don't have that blueprint of the X on the map in their head.
Yep. We had a great client meeting yesterday, and one of the reasons that it was great is because the week prior we had an opportunity to just have an open space conversation with the founder, and he was like, well, this is the vision, this is where I see the company going. And we said this to them, and so I think we can say it here, like 2025 for that company was a lot of whack-a-mole. It was just firefighting for almost a year straight. And now there's like, people got their heads above water a bit, and we can have space for those types of visioning conversations. And then all of a sudden what clicked for us was like, oh, now we can see how to start to pull all these different threads that we've been talking about working on for the last 9 months together, because we're no longer helping them firefight. When the things get dropped on their plate and they just have to deal with it today. It was like 9 months straight of that. And so now there's a point where we can create this through line. We can create this kind of single cohesive narrative and lay out a roadmap ahead that's going to give us the opportunity to, again, try and get from A to B in the most efficient manner possible.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about some of the scenarios that we see pretty typically and just how those problem and solution journeys have unfolded. Really common thing we see with the growing businesses is burnout, right? With growth comes more work, and with more work comes the struggle to manage all of that work. So how have we seen prioritization be like a really key solution for those teams that are struggling with burnout and chaos and overwhelm?
Part of the cultural understanding of prioritization is actually, it's often oriented to like where to go next. But I think an underrepresented part of the definition is what to let go of. The tendency in entrepreneurship is just more. And that's not the right skill set applied to everything in business. And so I think one thing that it does is it just gives leaders and teams permission to say no. We're going to let that go. There's so much window dressing in the world of prioritization and productivity. There's a new way to do it. It's this method. It's that method. Hot saunas and cold plunges are out, and now it's whatever. Like, sometimes prioritization just means saying no to the distractions, So I think first and foremost, it's just the permission to say no. It's one that isn't exercised enough in business. And again, like the larger the business, the more the opportunity. And the more complexity, the more distractions that come up. And the businesses that are really successful, particularly the mission-driven businesses that are really successful, is staying really tight with their aperture around what they're going to focus on and what that impact is going to be, and saying no to everything else around it, so that they're not diluting the resources, those finite resources that they have to devote to the cause. And then with that comes the skill set of learning how to just let certain fires burn. And this is a really uncomfortable process for most people in general, I think. But sometimes in business, to get to where you want to go, you just got to let certain fires burn. And so that thing that's a B-level priority, that's like, I probably should do that. But if doing that thing is going to take your finite resources below critical mass, meaning like you only have a certain amount of finite resources, and if you dip below the amount that's required to be effective in your endeavors, then you just harpooned your own pirate ship. If that makes sense. I could probably articulate that more clearly. But understanding how to let certain fires burn is not just saying no, but it's learning how to say no for now. Put that on the back burner. We'll deal with it later. Right now, we're just going after, strategic endeavor X, and nothing else matters until we master this. And then we can come up for air and kind of reevaluate. Because again, once you get to that next stage in business development, the priorities change. The landscape changes. And so doing that thing now that feels really important actually might not be that important 2 or 3 months from now. Or 2 or 3 years from now.
Right. And I would add, saying no to the correct things. Getting crystal clear on that meeting point between the viability of the business, clarity on values, and finding that strategic through line where it says, these are the things we absolutely have to do in the short term to get to daylight, and these are all the other things we're going to say no to, because they're not going to have, because if we don't get to daylight, none of these other things matter.
And I think back to back to what you articulated here at the beginning in terms of framing this entire conversation, this can be particularly challenging for mission-driven founders and leaders because generally by nature they're empathic, they're caring individuals. And so they have a lot of competing needs from a values-based standpoint because they can empathize with all of the different problems that they see before them. And their heart is in such a space that they want to address those problems. And so it's a really difficult skill to develop, or it can be for, some of these clients that we work with to just learn how to say like no. And one way that I think we've found success is by just kind of coaching this phrase of like, it's just no for now. Create a doc, put this in there, we can revisit it. But right now we just need to refocus on this thing that we said we're committing to. It usually with time, not only do you develop the skill set, but you also then gain perspective. So when you revisit that list 2, 3, 6 months later, or a couple of years later, you're like, oh, I wonder why I thought that was so important, because in retrospect, it wasn't really, but it's hard to get there.
Yep. So what if we go through a couple of specific examples and celebrate some of the heroic efforts we've seen from some of our clients? What they accomplished, how they did it, big outcomes. How about Kim at KPT?
Kim started, and she was very clear with her mission in terms of the engagement from the beginning. I love my team. They're working their tails off. Success in this project and this engagement means them getting their time back because right now their entire life is working. So she was very clear from the beginning. So that was great. It gave us something measurable, to benchmark against immediately. And she knew where she wanted to go. So we didn't have to take time helping her determine, okay, where should we go? And when she realized that there was no other 100% woman-owned business of her kind in her industry, in her state, she was like, oh, that needs to change. And so she did, She kind of pulled out from the business that she was in and said, I'm going to go start my own thing because 100% woman-owned business of this kind needs to exist. And that created a whole slew of additional complexities because all of the things certain decisions that were made for her team prior to them starting their own company, now they had to make as a small team. So I think that was a huge win because it was a values-based decision, but in reality, ironically, it created a lot more work. It was like we did all this work to get their time back, to smooth out their systems and, to get them to a place where they were more profitable and had a better quality of life and work-life balance. And then it was, okay, we're going to go do this thing. And then it ramped that engine all the way back up again and created more complexity. But that's definitely one thing that comes to mind just in terms of what were some of the successes. She literally took the pirate ship into uncharted territory. And that was really cool.
Can you talk a little bit more about the time management and getting people's lives back? That seems like a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I mean, the end result, again, the end goal was getting people's time back. And it took about a week to realize that in order to do that, we were going to need to do a lot of work upstream. And so what that ended up meaning was really getting clear with roles and responsibilities. There was a lot of overlap and redundancy that was unnecessarily created. Everyone was super helpful on the team. They were all trying to help one another out, but that actually created a lot of redundancy in their work. They would log in to try and do something and then realize that it had already been done or whatever. It also created a lot of confusion because there weren't clear lines in the sand in terms of who is responsible for what. And so I think those two things, that's kind of the two-headed snake right there. One is getting explicitly clear with what is this work process? How does this part of the business get done? And then the second question was, and who's responsible for it? And who's the backup? And so once we could get clear on those things, we actually didn't have to do a lot of productivity work because all of the extra work just fell away. And so what they realized and what we all discovered collectively along the way was once we, kind of cut it off upstream, the downstream impact of saving time was almost inevitable. And just from a time perspective, when we started with them, they were working 80 to 90 hour weeks, sometimes more. And by the time we wrapped, they were down to 35 to 40 and still doing the same amount of volume. So I think, that's of course compounded because it was a smaller team. So the numbers are going to be more amplified. But That's the kind of results, that thinking slow and moving slow and intentionally can have.
Okay. How about Haley McClellan?
Haley had a really unique position as the clinical director of an at-home nursing organization with a lot of complexity in a fast-growing startup. And, I don't necessarily want to speak for her, but from my perspective, one of the most impactful things that we helped her with was learning how to set her own boundaries in terms of workplace well-being and work-life balance, and giving her just a couple tools that were maybe missing in her tool belt or that weren't totally refined yet. It totally amplified her skill set and then made her able to translate that to the rest of her team. And so not only did her workplace well-being and satisfaction increase and her workplace or work-life balance improved, but then once it did for her, she was able to apply it to the rest of her team, of like 50. And so all of a sudden, everybody's work-life balance improves and everybody's workplace satisfaction increases. And so this is what I mean, when we talk about leverage. This is the type of impact that when you find those highly leveraged actions, or sometimes they're highly leveraged individuals within an organization, usually a leader or a decision maker. If you can help them, then that trickle-down effect is inevitable.
Speaking of that trickle-down effect, another pattern we see, which we've talked about a little bit, is leaders who started on the ground growing their business and then ended up in this position of being managers or needing to be managers, but not having experience with that role and have difficulty pulling themselves out of the day-to-day to do what the business really needs, which is for them to be thinking about that higher level strategy and making really hard calls about what everybody else should be prioritizing. So what are some of the ways we've seen that unfold? What are some of the interventions that have helped those leaders make that transition?
Yeah, the one that's top of mind for me right now is we're working with a company. Their leadership team, they've grown their business in a very democratic way, right? Consulting the team on what would generally be considered executive leadership decisions to make. But they talk to everybody in the company about it. And they've been really successful in doing that. But they're at a point now where the company is large enough that strategy is no longer the most effective way to make some of these challenging decisions. It's also creating a little bit of confusion amongst team members, and it's certainly impacting team dynamics because personal agendas are competing, for lack of a better term, with strategic endeavors in the business. So there's this conflation between professional priorities and personal preferences. So that one's top of mind right now, where it's like successful mission-driven leaders are often, again, they're very empathic, they're people-oriented, and they kind of have this like come-along attitude with them. And so usually what they end up developing is rather, democratic, egalitarian type leadership structures, which are great and sometimes not the most effective. So I think, if I were like creating a video game character of like the perfect mission-driven leader and I had to choose between like a democratic or egalitarian, come along approach versus like a dictator decision maker type person, I would obviously choose the former. But sometimes, as the business grows and as the mission evolves and becomes a little bit more complex, we just have to stretch that skill set a little bit. And usually what that means is helping leaders get to the point where they're going to make decisions that they know are going to make certain people unhappy or will impact them in a, quote unquote negative way.
At least in the short term, right?
Yeah, usually in the short term, but also in the sense of, sometimes they're permanent changes and they might just be really uncomfortable messages to deliver. Sorry, we're just doing it this way now. But because they don't want to disappoint people, because they're people, they're people oriented, that can be a place to kind of grow that type of.
Yeah. And so evolving leadership styles or developing that leadership skill set, big deal. What are some of the concrete skills we've seen those leaders have to develop?
I would definitely go back to, learning how to say no and learning how to let certain fires burn. I would also suggest like having hard conversations. We had a kind of a deep dive meeting last week with the client. And eventually the conversation got to the point where we just asked the question, how much of this is just your desire to not want to have this uncomfortable conversation with the team? And he was like, yeah, that's probably part of it. So we spent a long time talking about strategy, But in reality, it wasn't a strategy conversation. It was a personal development, self-awareness conversation. He wasn't ready to commit to that path because he wasn't interested in having that difficult conversation. And so having difficult conversations, I think, is important, which again, I think the other side of that coin is direct communication, or rather clear communication. And this goes back to helping team members understand what their role is and why it's important and how it rolls up into the larger mission of the business. You know, I'm terrible at this, but this notion of like, by speaking less, you'll actually say more. If you can be clear and direct with what you say, you actually don't need to say a whole bunch, but because you're clear and direct, it speaks volumes. I think that's a really important skill set and a tactical one that takes time to develop.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you're saying that, I'm sure there are plenty of democratic leaning leaders who are cringing a little bit saying, oh man, clarity and directness. So it sounds harsh. It sounds undemocratic. It sounds the opposite of empathetic. And we're not advocating that leaders don't exercise empathy in those conversations. That's not what we're saying at all. It's the content of what you're saying is separate from the approach that you use with human beings.
Absolutely.
And so, like you said, that's the line that leaders are often learning to walk,
Yep.
right? You're walking into the conversation saying, hey, I care about you. I also care about the mission of this company, as I know you do. So let's talk about how this is all important to us. In order to achieve that mission, this is what we're going to have to do. I'm asking you to come with me. This is my job up here in the CEO's office to make sure that we're all rowing in the same direction. And it's very clear this is the direction we have to row. I need you to come with me. I really hope you do. If you can't, then we're going to have to talk about what your role is here. And that's not an unsympathetic conversation. It's a real and an intentional and ultimately a compassionate conversation.
Yep. Going back to the beginning of the conversation, I said prioritization would be like one of my top 3 words. Humanity or human decency would be number 1, right? And so I agree. I hope that is clear to anyone listening, that's always the foundation that we're starting from, because those are the, quote unquote, soft skills, which is a terrible term. But those are the skills that really move the needle, from a mission standpoint, from an emotional, from a cultural standpoint within the organization. And as you were talking, there was actually one more thing that surfaced for me regarding like what are the tactical skill sets to develop. And the thing that I would toss in here is like the theory of constraints. For the leader out there who's listening, who probably knows that they need to have an uncomfortable conversation with someone on their team, but they don't really want to do it, and they're, there's other more important stuff to do, or they're convincing themselves there's other more important stuff to do. This theory of constraints I think is a really critical piece of a leadership skill set, in the sense of, a system will grow until it meets its constraint. And sometimes that constraint is a process, a work system, a workflow, but sometimes that constraint is a person. And in mission-driven organizations, generally speaking, the culture lean towards one of, yes, maybe democratic, but also like, we're here for this mission. And so when there is the person on the team who doesn't necessarily vibe or who ruffles a bit of feathers, that can create cultural challenges in an organization where people just want to focus on the mission. So if you have a constraint in your business, and if you're a leader and you're listening, it's almost a guarantee that you can identify what the constraint is. You don't have enough leads, your operations or your delivery is too sloppy, whatever it is. Or there's the person on your team that everybody else has a problem with. And either you haven't addressed it yet, or you haven't addressed it effectively enough yet. That notion of like identifying the constraint, figure out what the bottleneck is, find the choke point, and then allocate all of your resources to solving it is a big skill set. And it's one that I think is really, really underrepresented. Because it's easy to kind of put window dressing on things. We can distract ourselves with this stuff over here. But in reality, the business isn't going to grow. The impact isn't going to grow until that constraint is alleviated. And so it has to be addressed.
Closest thing we have to a mission statement, I would say.
That's probably an accurate term, yeah. Yeah, help you find the constraints and alleviate them.
Yeah, that's what we do, baby. Let's go into the lightning round real quick here. Just some simple takeaways, things people can try now if they're listening. If you're a leader struggling with burnout and overwhelm, one thing you can do right now to make a difference in your life.
I'll say 2. Personally, we were having this conversation at dinner the other night, breath work. Burnout is ultimately an expression of your nervous system. And so accept that and embrace that and start to find things that help heal your nervous system. And the one that is most accessible in the office is breath work. Taking 15 seconds or 5 minutes to just help reset your nervous system can make you far more productive for the rest of the day if that's what you need to do. It can help with emotional regulation, etc. And then professionally, if you're dealing with burnout, I would go right back to that theory of constraints. What is the thing that you are most avoiding right now? Or what is the biggest problem that you haven't solved? Start devoting as much time, resources, and attention to that as possible. Because until that thing is addressed, it's just going to continue to be a thorn in your side.
Okay. On that note, another thing we hear a lot with people when we meet them for the first time, I'm the CEO. I know what my most important work is, but there's just so much on my plate. I have a really hard time carving out time to do it.
Take a time to pause and think critically and do some inventory planning. Do the BOP it process. Brainstorm all of your tasks, organize them so that you can think about these challenges in an organized manner, and then prioritize them. And if you take the time to do that exercise, sometimes it'll only take 10 minutes. It will make it more clear what needs to stay on your plate, what needs to get delegated to somebody else's plate, what needs to be eliminated, like no one should be doing it or you shouldn't be doing it. And then, if possible, what could be automated, right? So I think that kind of eliminate, automate, delegate is a good framework for this. But it starts with the inventory process. Sit down, take the time to make the list, and then ask yourself the critical questions, the difficult questions. Because if you don't take time to change your circumstances will not change. It's never going to get easier the bigger your business gets.
And so much of the time, changing those circumstances is about prioritizing in a really intentional way. I think we just summarized the concept of prioritization, Ian.
Hopefully we did it some justice.
Yeah, it only took us an hour to get there. All right. Great talking to you, and this was fun. Looking forward to doing it again. Any ideas for our next topic? What should we prioritize as our next topic, bud?
Prioritize for our next topic. The thing that I'm actually interested in discussing here is this conversation was rather tactical, for lack of a better term, right? There's a lot of tools, techniques, blah, 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 strategy. And I think where it would be interesting to take this conversation next is like the underbelly of this whole conversation, which is the human dynamics, right? The cultural components of this work in an organization. So maybe the next one will be a role reversal and we can chat about that and I can interview you.
That sounds like a great idea. Tune into the turning point for culture and human dynamics of your mission-driven business. All right. Have a good weekend, Ian.
You too. Thanks, man.